Okay, we got a longish story that I want to impart to you. So let's get into it here into the background of the Graham Parsons and the Grievous Angel story. Now, in prep this week, I read a book called 20,000 Roads, The Ballad of Graham Parsons and His Cosmic American Music. And I also watched the Fallen Angel documentary about his life and times, in addition to reading various other interviews and writings. So, as I just mentioned, this is a tragic story. Graham was a self-destructive, highly traumatized guy who ultimately did inspire a lot of people with his vision for cosmic American music, as he called it, and probably is the father of anything you might deem to call alt country. But we can adjudicate that later. So the story goes way back to December 1941 in Pearl Harbor. Graham's
Oh,
dad
geez.
was a fighter pilot stationed there who was asleep when the bombing started. He ends up shooting down so many Japanese planes in the war that he gets called out by name on the Tokyo propaganda radio station.
Jeez.
Wow.
His name, by the
Yo,
way,
that's wild.
yeah, that's crazy, right? His name was Cecil Coondog Connor. He's a Georgia boy, and after the war, he came home to meet Graham's mother, a citrus heiress.
Coondog, that's his birth name. That's his
That's
given.
his
That's his
name.
Christian name, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right, yeah.
Right, exactly, yes. Graham's mother is a citrus heiress in Florida. Real old money stuff. Her grandfather bought
Damn.
some
Christ.
orange groves real early on, made a fortune, and together they come together and they make a baby called Ingram Cecil Connor, born November 1946 in a place called Waycross, Georgia, south central Georgia, very rural. So Graham is born to parents who are basically high society Southerners. Like we're talking mint juleps and fancy hats. And he's in a very small town. The town is too small for a record store, but
Oh,
folks
geez.
sometimes go to the auto parts shop to swap 45. That's where they're swapping records. And his real turning point, I thought this was interesting, is that he sees Elvis live. And like 6 months before, Elvis goes on Ed Sullivan. So before he's famous at all, while he's touring all those podunk places in the South that we talked about a
Wow.
little bit on our Elvis episode. This would be in 1956, right? This is before Heartbreak Hotel, before everything. And he is completely transfixed. And by the way, Elvis is the opener of the show at this point.
That's
But,
so funny.
How
it's
old was
true.
he at
How
that
old was
show?
Graham? Graham
Yeah, when
was
he
like
saw Elvis.
10 or
Oh,
maybe
okay.
maybe eight, between 8 and 10, something like that.
And
And
before we move on, what state did Forrest Gump live in again? Because this is awful. Like Forrest.
Alabama.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Going
but
back to
he's
Greenboro? Yeah.
but he is kind of, yeah, he's in, I guess the part of Georgia he's in is actually kind of closer to Florida than Atlanta, but it's definitely rural. It's a similar vibe. So from a very early age, he's hooked on music via Elvis. He starts taking piano lessons, maybe around 10. He's a very fast study. He's one of these kids who could hear something on the radio and play it back easily. He starts writing his own songs. He's intaking all this music as much as he can. And he's also a charming, confident guy with girls, from a very young age. He's also the kind of kid who thinks nothing of, let's say, greatly embellishing his stories to draw people in or entertain people. Some might call him a liar from an early age
Or an entertainer, like you said.
or an entertainer. But I think I am trying to get across that he was extremely charming and lovable. And you do hear that in all these interviews, all these people that he touched in his short life. So now his parents are socialites, like I said. They're not overly interested in parenting. So he kind of does whatever he wants, which will also persist throughout his life. But that said, they do have a pretty loving family. And I mentioned Rich, and I maybe should have mentioned this earlier, but for context, Graham's mother's family controlled 20% of the citrus industry in Florida and was worth around $300 million dollars in today's money.
Not too bad.
So they had some cash.
Right. Yeah.
So all that Florida's natural orange juice I'm buying every week is those dividends are going back to the Parsons estate, is what you're telling
Exactly.
me.
Well, I think that the family at some point ruined it. It's one of those things where grandfather builds it, son grows it, grandson, kills it.
Shoots it.
Exactly, yeah. So his dad notices his great interest in music and buys him a reel-to-reel tape recorder when he's 12. This is 1958. It's a Christmas present. It's a
Gee.
big one. But before his dad can give it to his son, he kills himself on December
Oh my
23rd.
God.
Now, rumors were that
Just 2 days
Jeez.
before Christmas.
2 days before
Oh my
Christmas,
God.
His father shoots himself. Rumors were that his wife was stepping out, but he was also a prolific drinker. That was almost certainly a factor, as was the fact that he probably was never fully embraced by his uber rich in laws. You can see how that might be a challenge, and PTSD from the war, of course. But in any case,
Just an army guy hanging out with all the debutantes. Probably didn't fit in.
It is a traumatic event. So,
Oh,
and by the way, this is the era where after they report the death to 12-year-old Graham, it is never brought up again.
Oh yeah, sure, of course. They're just like, Daddy is dead. His
End of story. We're moving to Florida. You will never talk to your dad's
never
family
talk
again.
about it. Oh my God.
Here's your reel-to-reel tape recorder. Merry Christmas.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Here's
Get
a
cracking.
picture of your father in his smoking jacket.
By the way,
That's
get
the
at
one
it
he's
in your
not
room
gonna
with
forget.
this tape recorder. Never mention this incident again.
So his
Was it
mother
like
is.
like a 2-track, a 4-track? What did he get?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that, but it might have. The excitement might have been dampened slightly.
Just a bit.
I could see that.
So they moved to Florida to be with his mother's family. His mother's distraught and lonely, and a couple months later, she meets a guy called Robert Parsons and is smitten. And this guy is like a traveling grifter type, slick back hair, investment opportunities in South America type of dude. He drives a Jag, even though he has no money. He keeps exotic animals as pets. He had an ocelot.
Florida man.
An
Florida
ocelot in the 60s?
Yeah. Yeah.
Ahead of
And
his time, man.
understandably,
Original Florida man.
the
Original
rich
Florida
family is suspicious. And but actually the truth is Robert Parsons is pretty good to the kids. He actually does, they get married quickly. He adopts Graham and his little sister. That's how Graham got his last name. So even though he is probably not a great person, and there's sort of more evidence to that later, Graham needs a father figure, and this guy steps in. So okay.
All right.
But guess what happens next? So so they do get married.
Kills himself too.
He takes the last name. They have a new baby. They're newly married. They have a new little kid, and they hire a 19-year-old babysitter to come in and watch the kid who
Man.
Robert Parsons promptly has an affair with. So
God.
now it's high society, so no one's talking about it. No one can even mention the word divorce. Graham's mother basically just starts drinking more heavily, right? But okay, Graham's in school. He's focused on music. He joins his first band when he's in 8th grade. He starts hopping from band to band, first few years of high school. And I wanted to bring up that even back then, at this early age, this is like the late 50s, early 60s, these kids like to push the envelope in terms of getting messed up. I mean, they're actually living in a dry county in Florida, but they would do things like inject oranges with vodka and then take them to high school lunch and get drunk off of that. Or, just take
Kind of
random
awesome.
stuff from the medicine
pretty
cabinet and be
clever,
like,
yeah.
what does this do? I'll take a few. Graham was an
I
envelope
mean, they
pusher.
had all those oranges sitting around. What else are you going to do with them?
I'll be honest. I'm still stuck on the 19-year-old live-in nanny. What the fuck are you thinking? It's never gonna work.
Right.
And I said, no, I only bring it up. I knew a dude once. Maybe we cut this out. Maybe we don't. We'll see. I knew a
His
dude
name
once.
is, and he lives. Here.
No. Him and his special lady were having some problems, and then they had a kid, second kid, and they got like a hot 20-year-old Brazilian living nanny, and I was like, dude, what are you
Terrible.
doing?
Terrible idea.
And then he moved out of town. I don't know how that landed. So
Yeah, it's not a great plan. That's a PSA for all of you would-be parents out there. So at this point, Graham's playing in various local bands. He's playing in Battle of the Bands competitions. He's mostly playing piano at this point and also singing. His parents aren't super engaged to notice his penchant for drugs. He's buying speed from truckers passing through town and stuff like that. But when he threatens to elope with a girl he just met, they step in and send him off to boarding school. So now it's 1963. The counterculture, the so-called 60s, is in its infancy. Graham starts playing guitar by now. He forms a band at boarding school called the Shilohs, basically a folk group in the style of something like the Kingston Trio or the Journeymen, which was a folk group that was fronted by young John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Are you mentioning you excited about the Kingston Trio, Adam?
Yeah. Well, just because I had heard of them. That makes me excited because I don't know anything about anybody.
So his high school band even manages to record, and then they head to New York for a summer where they meet John Phillips, again, the guy who would later form the Mamas and the Papas, who's a folk guy at the time, after a show, just because they're coming to every show he plays. And he ends up helping them get an audition for Bob Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman, who immediately offers them a contract. And then he learns that they're all underage and still in high school and immediately rescinds that offer. So point is,
opportunity.
He was getting a lot of good breaks. Yeah. As high school's winding down, he's getting a lot of playing time. In fact, this is another indication of how rich they were, that at one point during a winter break in high school, he invites the whole band to go back to Florida. I think he's at boarding school in South Carolina. He invites his whole band to go back to Florida to stay with him for the winter break. And Robert Parsons, always trying to work the angles, he opens up an entire coffee shop specifically so the band can gig while they're there.
Man, now that's a get.
Yeah. But in any case, Graham and his friends are traveling. They're playing shows. They're hanging out in New York in the early 60s. They're really learning what being a musician is all about, which is getting stoned. Which brings us to a special backcountry drug edition of Is It Punk? All right. Now in this game, I'm gonna describe something to you, and you have to answer, is it punk or not? So first up, when Graham was in high school, they talked about crushing up aspirins and sprinkling them into cigarettes to smoke and get high. Is that punk?
Phil, we lost your audio.
No, that's not punk, no.
That's correct, Phil. It is not punk. 9 out of 10 doctors actually recommend crushing up a baby aspirin and smoking it once a day. It significantly reduces your risk of heart attack. And we know anything that does that cannot be punk. Next up, later, when Graham made it to the scene in New York and LA, sometimes he and his friends would dip their cigarettes in a bovine tranquilizer and smoke that. They said it approximated a 2-minute acid trip. Is it punk?
Oh, hell yeah. I think that's punk. Just because that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard.
Yes, you are correct, Adam. Yes, to be a proud American, one must consume massive amounts of factory-farmed beef. It's your patriotic duty, in fact. Now, we all know those poor cows have all kinds of drugs in their system already, which are getting passed on to you. But to go ahead and cut out the middleman and just take the cow drugs directly, that's punk.
You hear lots of jokes about horse tranquilizers. People really sleeping on those cow tranks. Like, that's where the real party is at.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd never heard that one either. Okay, we got one last one here. Once, after a bird show, which is later in the story, Graham traveled by Rolls-Royce with the entirety of the Rolling Stones to take LSD at Stonehenge and party there all night long. Is that punk?
That's the hardest one I've ever heard.
Stonehenge has too much historical significance, not punk.
Oh. If you would have omitted the Rolls Royce, I would have said it was punk.
Oh, all right.
I say yes. The answer is yes. Sorry, I don't say anything. The definitive answer is yes.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's literally the coolest thing anyone's ever conceived of doing. Now, points deducted, as you mentioned, for the mode of transportation, I guess. But late 60s Stones were the coolest anti-authoritarian version of the band. Ooh. Plus, Stonehenge is all about druids and rituals. That is punk.
Yeah. Okay, I can see that. I'll allow it.
AF. Okay. Back to our story, and really back to more tragedy, which the story has plenty of. So on the eve of Graham's high school graduation, his mother dies in a hospital of cirrhosis at age 41. God. She drank herself to death. Bummer, right?
Jeez.
Graham most likely never processed this trauma either. Now, I should also point out that Graham was actually pretty smart, but also not super motivated, like maybe other rich kids we might know. So naturally, he applied to only one college, Harvard. And get this, he gets in.
Yeah.
Now, actually, it's seemingly a perfect fit because it's a bunch of rich kids at a college. And it's kind of counterculture for its day, right? This is like 1965. This is about 2 years after Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert were kicked off campus and effectively became counterculture heroes. But All during this time, he's intaking a lot more country music, in particular, stuff like Buck Owens and Merle Haggard, the so-called Bakersfield sound that was breaking away from Nashville at the time. And you will all recall we covered Buck Owens on episode 139. And also Ray Charles' modern sounds in country and western music is a big influence as well, which was sort of about taking those old country songs and modernizing them and somewhat legitimizing them, right? And we discussed that on our Ray Charles episode 149, so check those out. But in any case, things are happening in the genre of country music. There's some splintering away from that really clean Nashville sound, and it's still not considered a sophisticated art form, and that is something that Graham really keys in on and wants to be a part of, right? So after a semester at Harvard, he just decides he can't hack it. He needs to pursue music. He drops out. He goes to New York. He pulls together a band called the International Submarine Band, the first of many terrible band names he will invent.
That's pretty.
I actually kind of like that. It's just odd. Of course, I would like it, but anyway.
Yeah, he's got a real knack for naming these bands.
Okay, they tour a bit. They record and open for the Rascals in Central Park, and on a lark, they decide to try their luck in LA. While there, they open for the Doors in 1967. They meet tons of LA scenesters and party with them. Drug use ramps up, but always in the background, there's this disparity between Graham and the rest of the band. So while his bandmates are struggling to get by, Graham is rich. He's living off of a trust fund that pays him around $60,000 a year, which is the equivalent of something like $400K in today's money.
Jesus.
The rest of the band does not have that luxury.
Must be nice.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And even though he's relatively generous with his cash and, amongst his friends, it's a stark dividing line. And it really says a lot about how committed he is to working on the thing and versus his bandmates, right? So it makes it hard for everyone to be on the same page. So now in this time period, I should mention that long hairs, so-called long hairs, did not play country music. It simply was not done. In 1967, if you walked into a country bar with a hippie haircut, you are getting serious Easy Rider level aggression stares, possibly just getting beat up for no reason.
Yeah.
You are definitely not welcome. Like there was a very clear dividing line there. But Graham's got confidence, and he's got a self-destructive streak, so that makes it perfect, because he'd walk into these places casually, get up on stage, start playing Buck Owens tunes, kind of win the people over slowly, but he definitely does not look like someone who should be playing country music, and he kind of fought against that by knowing so much about it and being really into it.
Yeah, because country at the time was very buttoned up. Like, again, the Buck Owens, like they're wearing their rhinestone suits and everything is very put together. And I can just imagine somebody, again, just kind of coming in a little ramshackle, but killing it. It would be very cool to see.
And the country world at that time was like, super produced, right? It was super, tight ownership of the look and the sound. It was like the mafia, in its way.
That Nashville machine thing.
I don't think he fit into that prescriptive country system.
No, definitely not. But even as the music was loosening up, like in the Bakersfield way, and you would walk into these dive bars with a bunch of country biker type dudes listening to music, there still was a formality about the look. I think that's important to understand, right? In addition to some formality about the music at times. So International Submarine Band does end up putting out a record, but pretty much right at that moment, Graham gets a random opportunity to join the Byrds, who are a huge band.
Right.
And it's in part because they've just fired David Crosby and they're looking for some changes in the sound, and he jumps at it, right? And by the way, side note, I'm sure we'll get to the Byrds later because they have several records on the list, but they were apparently a very dysfunctional band throughout the entire time they were a band. They were like barely friends. Everyone kind of knew that they weren't even friends. They never hung out off stage, that kind of thing. And that pretty much continued. So
I think it's important to hate your bandmates.
It's where the creativity stems from.
Right?
That's the energy you want to bring to stage.
So that's what people come for,
So Graham is the guy who knows country music, and he more or less takes over the band, the Byrds, at least creatively or at least genre directionally, right? And they go in with him to record Sweetheart of the Rodeo at his direction. It's also on Diamery's list. It is a straight ahead country album, or maybe a country rock album. There's some standards on there. There's some Parsons originals on there. when we will get back to it eventually. So Graham's time in this band actually only lasts about 6 months, even though he does have a major impact on the band.
No way. I thought it was longer. Okay.
They record this record. Before it comes out, he's clashing with Roger McGuinn, the de facto leader of the band, pretty much from day one. And he's generally on the outs with everybody. He's not an easy person to be friends with, or maybe be in a band with sometimes too. He's a little unreliable. So during this period, they toured London, and the Stones, including Keith Richards, come to the show. Because again, the Byrds are this huge act, right? They've had a ton of influence. And Keith and Graham become instant best friends. Keith just falls in love with him like instantaneously, and now he's in that circle, right? And I think one of the reasons for that, obviously they just hit it off personality-wise, but I wanted to mention that Graham was seen by Keith and by some of these other musicians as an authentic descendant of American roots music, especially to the British musicians he met. Rock and roll, if you think about it, is sort of in its second generation at this point. The first was coming out of the American South with the blues and gospel traditions and some of that country tradition mixed in. The second wave is being led in large part by white kids from the UK, right? And they're excited to talk to someone who's more authentically ensconced in the American tradition. So that's part of it.
That's so funny. And that they identified him because his backstory, sure, his musical lineage might be a little more authentic, but he is definitely not hard scrabble blues guy, country, work the fields kind of thing. Like he's kind of the rich kid coming over. So that's funny.
Absolutely. So, okay, like I said, we'll cover the Byrds at some point. We did touch on this story during a previous episode, but I just got to mention how he quits the Byrds. The previous episode was the Flying Burrito Brothers episode. The band were in London. They were scheduled to play some concerts in South Africa. The Stones pulled them aside and tried to convince the whole band not to go, to protest apartheid. But Roger McGuinn's like, no, we have a contract. Like, I'm not hearing it. The Byrds are going. And on the morning of the flight to South Africa, with the bags packed and the cabs have the motor running, Graham just doesn't show up. And then when Roger goes to his room, he won't leave the room or talk to him about it. That's him quitting the Byrds.
Jeez.
So, he burned some bridges, we could say.
Yeah.
There. Now, Graham, of course, says it was about learning about apartheid that made him want to ditch this band. But he already wasn't getting along with these guys. They were constantly butting heads. And on a previous episode, the Flying Burrito Brothers episode 55-ish, I believe, we posited two other explanations for why he didn't go. Fear of flying was one, although they definitely did fly. They got to London, right? I think that was based on the idea that the Burrito Brothers did a train tour at one point, and they maybe said to a reporter that it was about fear of flying. I mean, that might have been a factor, but I don't think that was the main factor. A bigger factor is probably that Graham is just a star fucker who wanted to stay and hang out with the Rolling Stones.
I mean, who wouldn't? I could
right?
totally, right? Yeah.
And so I think it's probably all these
just,
things a little bit.
They just took him to Stonehenge to drop acid, right?
Right.
You go to South Africa? No.
Does not get better than that.
To work?
Yeah, it's like
No, thank you.
Next you like indoctrinate me into the Illuminati or something. Like what comes next? Who knows?
So he's only in the Byrds for like 6 months, and the record hasn't even come out yet. In the end, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, the record they made together, it's not very successful commercially, but it becomes a bit of a cult classic country album. But unfortunately, over contract disputes, most of Graham's vocals get cut from the final product. Or was it Roger McGuinn erasing him from the picture during the mixing sessions? It's hard to say, right? Now, Graham heads back to LA to start again. He comes ever so close to joining another band starting up at this time. A low-key favorite on this show goes by the name of Poco.
Yes!
Now, Richie Furay digs him and wants him in the band, but Jim Messina puts the kibosh on Graham Parsons joining Poco.
What could have been? What could have been?
After a few more months of bouncing around, his old Byrd bandmate, a guy called Chris Hillman, leaves the Byrds. They reconnect. They start Flying Burrito Brothers. Yet another terrible name. As I said, as I've been talking about, we covered their debut record, Gilded Palace of Sin, way back on episode 55. So I'll breeze through this. But suffice to say, they were pioneers in this cosmic country fashion, country music played by long-hair hippie types or in a rock band format. And they did other silly things like touring the country on a train, which was not lucrative, certainly. So I'm kind of skipping through that because you can go reference episode 55 if you like. Now, little side note, because I had always wondered about this. I always heard this rumor. The Burritos ended up recording, not on Gilded Palace of Sin, but on their follow-up, they recorded Keith Richards' song Wild Horses before the Stones did it for Sticky Fingers, right? Which led to a lot of incorrect speculation that either Graham had wrote it, co-written it, that was about him, any of that stuff. I couldn't find any substantiation of any of that. It is 100% a Keith Richards song.
Okay.
And he just offered it to Graham before the Stones made the definitive version of it on Sticky Fingers.
I definitely thought it was a Graham Parsons song for the exact reason you just described. And it makes sense.
I think it is very fair to say that a lot of the Rolling Stones sound in the 70s was influenced by Keith's relationship with Graham Parsons. And because we'll talk more about it, he even shows up in the recording sessions for Exile on Main Street. But that period of the Stones, that kind of Sticky Fingers, Exile period, they're the best American band that is somehow British. I don't understand it either. We'll get back to those records later, right? So clearly that is being influenced by Graham Parsons. Now, the Burritos, I should say, also played Altamont, which is kind of an interesting historical factoid. That's the infamous free concert in Northern California that the Rolling Stones put on in December of 1969 and had the Hells Angels provide security, and a fan got killed and several others badly beaten, and it was really a bad scene. They made movies about it. Maybe you've heard of it, right? So at this point, Graham is way more interested in hanging out with Keith Richards or the Stones entourage than he is of working with the Flying Burrito Brothers. And speaking of which, he was specifically pals with Keith, not Mick. In fact, Mick was sort of nakedly jealous of their relationship at all times.
He sliding, stealing his buddy.
Yeah, exactly. And the read on this that I heard was that Mick kind of feels like he stole Keith away from his old best buddy, which is Brian Jones, who were the original core of the Rolling Stones.
And then murdered him.
That too. And no, he probably didn't do that. And, and then he didn't, obviously they had a really creatively satisfying partnership going on with songwriting, and that's continued to this day of recording. The Rolling Stones are still around. Keith and Mick are still working together. So he definitely felt threatened by that relationship. There's even an incident that I read about where the Flying Burrito Brothers had a gig and they couldn't find Graham. And so they go to a Stones recording session that's in LA or whatever, and they have to like pull Graham out of there and he's like, he won't come to the gig, to the point where Mick apparently got up in his face and is yelling at him like, you have a responsibility to your bandmates, get the hell out of here.
Jeez. Can you imagine being scolded by Mick Jagger?
Right, exactly.
Wild.
So no huge surprise.
He's just using a ton of drugs at this point too, right?
Yeah, I think the drug use is slowly but steadily ramping up. As we know, Keith Richards is a fan as well.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure there was a lot of music and a lot of getting high too.
Absolutely. A lot of different kinds of ways to get high as well. So
no judgment, right?
No judgment. No judgment.
Yeah, but
well, look, if you can handle your shit, you can handle your shit. What do you want me to say?
I mean, Keith passes no judgment. That's what I mean.
No, definitely not. So, in any case, he gets fired from the Flying Burrito Brothers, right? And the Flying Burrito Brothers, as we sort of mentioned, they were a hit with other bands. They were considered new and pioneering, but they weren't a commercial success at all. They did continue along without Graham. But back to Graham's story, right? He's already experimenting with heroin at this point. But one thing that most certainly drives him deeper into that is that he gets into a bad motorcycle accident. And he gets into the accident because he tries fixing the bike himself with a coat hanger, which results in the handlebar fork detaching and hitting the pavement while he's riding it.
Now that's country. That's country. Who's going to say this guy's spoon fed now? Huh? No silver spoon in his mouth. Fixing my motorcycle with a coat hanger.
There's a silver handlebar in his mouth.
Yeah.
Okay,
Dude,
so in other
crazy.
heroin news, around mid-1971, he gets invited to the south of France, Keith's place, where the Stones were in tax exile and recorded the classic album Exile on Main Street. We will definitely loop back and cover the Exile story, both because it's a great record and because in some ways it's an archetype of the mythical sequestered album recording session. I really think that's where that idea started, and so we'll get there. But anyway, my point is he does a bunch more heroin with Keith, and he eventually gets kicked out of those sessions and sent home with his tail between his legs. Now, there's a rumor that Keith needed him gone because he, quote, thought Graham was doing too much heroin, which is really saying something.
That's intense.
Yeah, when Keith finally lets you know enough is enough, you know.
Yeah, and I read Keith's autobiography some years back, and I remember specifically him talking about how he was going to be sequestered in France, so he ordered like a 5 pound bag of uncut heroin, and then he had to.
Holy
It was so strong that
shit.
he had to like do math and like cut it down with baby powder himself.
God.
But okay,
Oh, heroin math. That's great.
good time. Hey man, he's still kicking. He's still out
He
there
is.
doing
He
his
did
thing,
something right.
So something's
Solid
happening.
math skills.
So after exile, on both the record and Graham's situation when he gets kicked out, he gets married. He moves into the Chateau Marmont in LA, kind of a posh old hotel. He collects a bunch of Elvis's backing band to head into the studio to record his first solo record entitled GP. Now, at this point, during these sessions, he's drinking a lot. He could barely sing. He's chubby for the first time in his life. His friends slap him around a little, tell him he's blowing it. So he straightens up enough to finish it. But side note from this era, possibly just before he got a recording plan together and was just futzing around, there's a quote from one of Graham's handlers at the time about how messed up he was. And this guy says, I got a phone call to go down to the studio. Graham was on the floor trying to sing a vocal, and the engineer was asleep at the console, and the console was off, and there were no lights on in the whole place.
Oh,
I
So
shouldn't laugh, but
He
was he funding
That's
his
rough.
own handlers since he's really rich?
Yeah,
Or
yes.
like they're a
It's
record?
like he had
Yeah,
body
I was-
men around him.
I was thinking too, this wealth must just be fueling this habit, right? Because none of these past projects really got any major commercial success. So he's really got this bottomless well to pull from to fund his habit.
It's true. Effectively
400
400K a year.
Yeah.
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 So fucking much.
It's true. And you know, to be fair, you do hear a lot of addicts, or I've heard rich addicts say, hey man, it's not really a problem, even heroin, until you run out of money. Like if you can get it and you can pay for it, it's a very manageable habit. The problem comes in when you can't get it or you can't pay for it and you start doing various things to get it.
Right.
Not quite the case here, but yeah, suffice to say his trust fund is driving a lot of this. But during that recording session, lightning strikes. He gets a recommendation to check out a young singer named Emmylou Harris. Emmylou was playing small clubs after she had made it to New York at the very tail end of the folk scene there. She had released one record that didn't go anywhere, and she was feeling really jaded about the music business and living in DC and actually thinking about retiring from the business entirely. So Graham sees her, immediately falls in love with her singing voice, and puts her on that record. Now, around this time, I should mention that Graham is severely bummed that country rock is now the thing and that his influence is not being cited and he's not riding the fame train. And then it's all kind of being commoditized. I mean, maybe it would never have been enough for him, but think of the Grateful Dead's American Beauty, very country influenced. His old bandmate Bernie Ledden from the Burrito Brothers, who's founded a new group called Eagles.
The Eagles, right,
Now,
right.
Graham publicly called them a plastic dry fuck.
Oh,
That's fair.
He's not in a good place. He doesn't
not in a good
feel
place.
like he's gotten his due. And, you know, but
It's-
clearly influenced these other bands and this move towards countrification of rock and roll.
This is one of the only records, and it's the Ooh Las Vegas song in particular, Scott, that really got me. I was like, man, this sounds like the Grateful Dead more than anything I've maybe ever heard. And what I mean by that is like it seemed to like capture the essence of that sort of like California Tex-Mex jam band
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, you know, we've all heard a lot of bands that try to do the Dead, and it's like silly, you know, but like that seemed to capture a different essence.
Well, this is totally tangential. I agree. It does sound like the Dead, especially via guitar playing. But I think that probably is another example of someone like Jerry Garcia felt like he really grew up in that tradition, then moved away
course.
from it to have this rock band, this psychedelic rock band, and then was like trying to get back to that more and more, right? Because he started as a bluegrass player.
right, right.
Okay, the record GP comes together somehow. At one point, Merle Haggard was attached as a producer, but he backs out at the last second. It's got some level of interest and acclaim as it releases, but not a lot. They head out on a tour called the Fallen Angels Tour, and frankly, it starts out pretty rough. It's a new touring band. Graham is messed up night after night. The band starts playing one song. He sings another song.
Oh,
Emmylou is trying to watch his mouth to figure out how to harmonize with him.
But the
He's messed up.
band is smoking, right? This is Elvis's backup band. So these guys
Elvis's backup
are
band, I don't think went on the road with him though.
oh,
So
okay.
they're in
Okay.
the
All right.
studio, and the new band is trying to figure him out, and he's just at a low point.
Got it. Okay.
But they do get tighter over time, particularly him and Emmy Lou. And I get the impression that Graham himself kind of eventually he was on the road to cleaning up at this point, right? So, and I should point out that they sing together so beautifully. I feel like it has to be mentioned. Everyone in this arrangement states that they never had a romantic relationship, but it certainly feels like they have a very special connection.
Yeah.
But okay, back off the road from this tour, Graham, who's got a 2-album contract, sets about working on number 2. That's Grievous Angel, the one we're talking about tonight, what will become that. Before the sessions can begin in earnest, yet another tragedy and seminal event for Graham Parsons. A guitar player and close friend of his named Clarence White dies at 29 when a drunk driver hits him during a loadout after a gig.
Ooh.
So this dude was in the
Standing
Birds,
around?
just standing around loading gear.
What a shitty way to go. Oh my God.
And this dude was a great player. He was in the Birds for a while. He did like tons of country session work. He has a lot of great credits. But one of the reasons, other than the tragedy itself, that it impacts Graham is the funeral that Graham and some of his friends go to is super conservative and Catholic and not at all personalized. And it really bums him out and his friends. And the priest in charge literally does not mention Clarence's name during the entire service. Like, that's how impersonal it is, right? And
Yeah.
apparently there is this beautiful moment at the funeral where Graham impromptu stands up and leads a cathartic sing-along of the song Farther Along, which is an old hymn you guys might know. It's a great song. There are versions by the Burritos, the Birds, Johnny Cash, people like that. It's beautiful. So cut to Graham drinking with friends after the service. With one friend in particular, he makes a pact. He says, whichever one of us dies first, don't let this happen to us. I don't want this low-key religious ceremony. Don't let this happen to me. I want to be cremated, and I want my ashes scattered at Joshua Tree in the desert outside of LA, which is a favorite hangout of him and his friends at the time. Hint to the listeners, this is called foreshadowing. Graham
Very subtle. Thank you.
and Emmy Lou begin the Grievous Angel sessions in the summer of 1973. It's a much more planned out affair because they've been on the road together now, and a lot of these songs were getting played on the tour, worked out on the tour. They're much tighter as singers, etc. He reassembles Elvis's TCB band, the Taking Care of Business band, who are awesome.
Hell yeah. Yeah.
That's James Burton on guitar. It's Glenn Harden. That's drummer Ron Tutt. That's bassist Emery Gordy from all from this band. And there's also guest stars on the record you might have noticed, like Linda Ronstadt, and Bertie Ledden is on here as well. Side note, the bass player, Emery Gordy, is the first producer listed on Steve Earle's Guitar Town, which we reviewed a long, long time ago, and which I won't tell you the episode number for because we weren't super kind to it.
Outlaw
okay.
country, baby. Outlaw country.
Definitely Steve Earle was influenced by this, for better or worse. So
Right.
now Graham is somewhat struggling with new material, and he's anxious to record nonetheless. So you're getting some of these country standards mixed in, which was kind of the style at the time. It's sort of how his first record is as well. And we talked about Willie Nelson's Redheaded Stranger, right? And you also get 2 rather old Graham Parsons songs, Brass Buttons, which he had recorded with the Burritos, and a song called Hickory Wind, which he had recorded with the Birds. It's actually on Sweetheart of the Rodeo. But that said, according to everybody, these sessions were happy, extremely happy by comparison to that first record. Some folks around him say he was off heroin entirely at this time. And while that's not completely clear, he was at least hiding it way, way better. So they finish up pretty quickly. They finish up in September. And to celebrate, Graham decides to head to his favorite spot in the world, Joshua Tree National Park. This was like a home away from home, a little motel called the Joshua Tree Inn. It's out in the desert outside of LA, right? And a crappy little dive bar where him and his musician friends would go to unwind. He's with his semi-estranged wife, Gretchen, but she's still there, and another woman, plus his best bud, Phil Kaufman, who he made the pact with. Now, pact buddy Phil decides to drive off into the night to score some weed. While he's gone, Graham buys some morphine from a stranger. He takes 2 shots of it. By the way, it is chemically very similar to heroin. While he's in the motel, he takes 2 shots of it and he ODs. And as we mentioned on the Burrito Brothers episode, his girlfriend initially revives him with a home remedy of putting an ice cube up his butt.
Yeah, I've read that
I
remedy.
do kind of
Which
remember that. Yeah.
it's hard not
There's
to think that's slightly funny, but
I read a book about the band once, and this remedy came up, like a big pink situation.
apparently it works very well. Because
All
even in
right.
this instance, they say he popped right up and the patient seemed awake and okay, somewhat okay, right? And so they kind of relax a little bit. Unfortunately, the protocol after that is that you're supposed to keep the person awake, and Graham slips off to sleep and stops breathing. Now,
Oh,
neither person
God.
he's with is overly practiced at dealing with this situation, and of course, they're afraid of the police. It takes them way too long to call an ambulance. By the time the pros get there, Graham is too far gone. He's
Oh,
declared dead at the hospital in September of 1973. He is 26.
Oh,
So
man.
the official cause of death is a little inconclusive. It's either what they call a relapse OD, which is he thought his tolerance was higher than it was, and he took a sane amount and it just affected him differently, or it's some kind of conglomeration, heart attack from drinking and pills, and he was probably on sleeping pills at the time as well as drinking a bunch of alcohol and just beating your body up, generally speaking, right? Either way, this feels like a good moment to do Graham Parsons by the numbers.
Yeah.
First number I want to throw out to you is number 3. That is, including this one, the number of album covers designed by the same designers that we've covered here on this show. The other covers, by the way, are You Experienced and Astral Weeks,
Hmm.
which perhaps not coincidentally are also slightly out of focus shots of the artist. I
Of
don't
the
think any of them
head.
is
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
particularly
they all
great.
kind of have that same kind of vibe, right? Yeah.
But I bring it up
Totally.
so that I can tell you this designer's name, which is Ed Thrasher.
That is awesome.
that's punk.
All right. Next number 2, the number of 70s songs that were written about Graham by other artists, at least 2. There's My Man, written by Bernie Leadon and appearing on the Eagles' On the Border, and the track Crazy Eyes, the title track from Poco's 1973 album, which was released a few days before Graham died. By the way, that Poco also does a cover of Brass Buttons on there.
Oh, nice. All
Now,
right.
again, audience, these Poco references are really just for Adam, but anyone else is welcome
Yeah.
to get excited about them also. All right. All right. Next number is number 2. Graham died at 26, just 2 months shy of his 27th birthday. Just 2 months shy of his 27th birthday, which would have put him in the vaunted
Yeah.
27 club. He couldn't even get that part of rock stardom correct.
Bummer.
Next number is 195. That is the highest chart position of Grievous Angel on the Billboard charts. Though it was instantly critically acclaimed, it would take a long time for it to become a cult classic and to be heard by many, many people. And nowadays it is in the 400s on Rolling Stone's top 500 albums of all time.
All right.
And I got one final number for you all. It is 17, as in 17 cents per day. That's what our Patreon will cost you to join up. Buy us a single domestic beer each month, which we will share while recording this. And you will immediately gain access to hours and hours of bonus content. You probably know if you're a loyal listener, we work really hard to bring you this research and hilarity. And we sincerely do appreciate y'all listening to us yammer and stammer through it every week. The bonus content like Song Battle or Guilty Pleasures is now a library's worth of us cutting loose even more, breaking up the format a bit, talking about the songs we love and don't love, but of course, still giving you 1,000,001 tidbits of music history that you can repeat until your friends politely ask you to stop. And if that's a bridge too far, we totally get it. Consider joining up completely for free. Get into the comment threads with not only other listeners, but us. We're in there too, defending ourselves, throwing each other under the bus more so. And it's a rollicking good time, I assure you. So regardless of how you choose to support us, we do appreciate it, folks.
And
Okay.
I'm not saying you should swap out your Save the Children 17 cents a day, but I'm saying in addition to, you could help.
Yes, very reasonable. All right, we're going to close out Graham's story here, and then we're going to talk about the songs. So you'd think Graham's story would end here with his death, but it does not. What
More tragedy?
follows?
No.
What follows is one of the stranger rock and roll stories in history, so it must be told here. Phil Kaufman is Graham's friend and sort of his body man, and also the guy who was with him at the Uptight funeral, and they made this pact together. Don't let this happen to me. So Kaufman had been with Graham that night, as I mentioned, but he had left to go out for more drugs and thus felt really guilty about not being there when Graham died, when Graham needed him. Plus, he wanted to fulfill his friend's wishes, right? So briefly, let's just touch on who this dude even was. He's an outlaw biker guy who worked security for the Stones in LA for a bit. That's how Graham met him. He also has a weird claim to fame that he had known a guy called Charles Manson while in jail in the 60s. This is before Manson was famous, and befriended him, and even lived at the Manson Ranch before the Helter Skelter murders again.
Wow.
And seemed like he absolutely did not shy away from that factoid after Manson became a celebrity, even after the trial went down.
Also
And
punk.
yes, and in
Also
fact,
so punk.
speaking of punk, here's the best beat, because if you might recall that those Helter Skelter Manson murders, the trial included the eventual conviction of 3 young women, I want to say teenage women or early 20s, and Kaufman was heard to remark to several people that he had slept with all 3 of them on multiple occasions.
What a clap back.
Nice.
Dirtbag, man.
The trifecta.
He's definitely a dirtbag. So I don't think I'm telling tales out of school here. I think everyone pretty much agrees. On the back of the Grievous Angel record album, which I have sitting next to me here, he is credited with executive nanny services, by the way.
That sounds gross. Given
I'm just trying to stress that he wasn't afraid of running afoul of law enforcement particularly. So
Yes.
he gets back to Joshua Tree that night. He finds out Graham died. First things first, let's clean up the room. I got to clear everything out. I got to bleach everything, whatever, so the cops don't find any drugs. And then he hatches a plan to steal the body. Now, to do this,
Wait.
to
Steal
do
the
this,
body?
I know it's
Okay,
hard to
sorry.
even believe that
Go
this
ahead.
actually happened.
Because I can get the shovel buddy aspect. You go in and you clean the room, you throw out whatever.
Sure.
But
That's just
all right. I'll let you go.
that's
Go
just being a bud.
ahead. right.
No, this is above and beyond, let me tell you. So he borrows a hearse somehow, and he shows up at the small airport where Graham's coffin is being loaded into a plane to head back to his family, who's now living in New Orleans. And he talks his way into getting them to hand the coffin over to him,
Yeah,
just through
yeah.
bluster, just through, he's like wearing a suit or whatever, and he's like, no,
This
they
makes-
said it needs to go with me.
This makes perfect sense. That's how I would do it.
Yeah.
Then
Confidence.
apparently, right as he's getting possession of the coffin with Graham's body in it, a cop pulls up and starts walking towards them with a kind of "what the hell are you doing" sort of stare. So he thinks quickly, and he asks the cop for help putting the coffin into the hearse, and the cop helps him.
Yeah.
Then he and another buddy speed away into the desert, drinking and hollering. Right? They're definitely drunk as this is happening, in case that's not clear. They get to Joshua Tree that night. They pull the coffin out. They open it. They then comment on Graham's naked body, and by this I mean make dick jokes about their dead friend. Then they pour kerosene all over him and set it aflame. Then, of course, they get the hell
Why?
out of there.
Dude, that is insane.
It's pretty wild.
I mean, we can enter some kind of death pact. I'm down with that, but like, I don't need or want all this. Just
Yeah, use a professional. In
Yeah.
the pact is that there's a
corpse-
contingency
I
there
believe-
that you have to use
Just
a
to be
professional.
clear, what Graham said was, "I'd like to be cremated and have my ashes scattered."
I'd like to be soaked in kerosene and set ablaze on the side of a road. Oh,
Yeah, and I
wow.
heard an interview with the other guy who's not Phil Kaufman, who was kind of like along for the ride and enlisted for this, and they were like, Graham's body had an autopsy. It wasn't like embalmed and ready for a viewing. It was like grotesque.
Oh,
and-
God.
Anyway, so yeah, it's weird, right? He burns, I guess, most of the night. He's discovered the next day. His body was, of course, very badly burned. What remained of him was shipped back to the South and interred in a small ceremony. He's buried in New Orleans, what's left of him. Philip Kaufman got charged with what he quipped was Graham theft Parsons.
I mean, that's pretty good.
It
Yeah,
is
I
good.
can't sleep
For a
on
complete
that.
sleaze
man.
bag. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
pretty good.
I think they actually got him for a coffin theft. Like, it seems like the cops really did not know what to make of this crime. It was so bizarre. So he ends
I
up
feel
just
like
paying a
corpse-
fine and getting
Corpse
probation.
desecration's a thing, right? I don't know if that's whatever.
Can you imagine when they got the whole story of the cop that ran into him at the airport? That guy never fucking lived that down. Comes back to the station. Hey, what's up, buddy?
Can
Indeed.
you help me move this water cooler? Shut
Yeah,
up.
exactly.
Okay. So yeah, that is how Graham Parsons. That's what happened to him after his death. It's pretty
Whoa,
pretty
dude, that's crazy.
bizarre. I believe there was like a terrible movie made about this called Graham Theft Parsons, which maybe Phil Coffin helped get made where Johnny Knoxville played Phil Kaufman. I didn't watch it,
Johnny
but
Knoxville.
anyway.
Like a precursor to Weekend at Bernie's. This adapted screenplay on morphine.
Seriously. Okay,
I've
but now
always thought they should make a Weekend at Bernie's 3 where Bill Murray plays Bernie and he's just dead the whole time. They just drag around alive Bill Murray.
Pretty good.
Okay. We're now on to the release of Grievous Angel. Graham dies in September of 1973. It comes out in January of 1973. So just a couple more details, then we'll talk about the songs. Despite Graham's death and the body theft story, which created a fair amount of press, as you can imagine, at the time, the album didn't sell very well initially. Even in death, you'd think that would be the one thing you could do for your career. It didn't really crystallize.
Didn't move the needle.
Now, here's another bummer. Graham had apparently wanted and even taken photos for the cover that showed him and Emmylou getting equal billing and equal weight in the photo. But unfortunately, after his death, Graham's then wife, Gretchen, who he was kind of estranged from and who none of his friends liked, got to make all the decisions about his estate. So she chose this weird fat photo of him that we're seeing here.
Yeah, it's a little not exactly flattering.
It's not flattering. No, he's definitely a handsomer looking guy at other times in his life.
Yeah.
And it's a bummer that Emmylou got downgraded. She, on the back of it, it says with Emmylou Harris, but in Graham's mind, it was definitely like a joint album the whole way. And she also, Gretchen, his estranged wife, she also named the album. Graham had recorded a song called Sleepless Nights and had plans for that to be the name of the album as well, but she went with the one he had a hand in writing, which does make sense, and ultimately I think that was a good change. Sleepless Nights was a cover song. But ultimately, critics did praise it when it came out. Robert Christgau, noted grump, said, Emmylou Harris cuts Parsons' soulfully dilettantish quaver with dry, dulcet mountain spirituality.
Jesus Christ.
Guy can write a sentence.
I know.
Emmylou, as I mentioned, got a solo deal with Warner Brothers based on this record and went on to have a great career. And, of course, the legacy of this record continues to grow. There's been a few benefit concerts celebrating Graham's music and his influence, a music festival that ran for around 10 years called Graham Fest with the theme of cosmic American music, and various tribute albums and bands, tribute recordings of these songs over the years. So it's grown in popularity as the years go on. That is the end of our story. Shall we talk about some songs, gents?